What is a child's childhood worth? For Seeta's father, it was worth exactly $2,500, the amount of debt he needed to settle. At 11 years old, she was sold to a 50-year-old man. But this transaction hid something much more disturbing than a simple forced marriage. On that March morning in 2010, while still playing with improvised cloth dolls in the yard of her adobe house, Seeta heard the words that would forever destroy her childhood. In 3 days, you will have a husband. She didn't fully understand what that meant. How could an 11-year-old child comprehend that she was being sold to solve adults' financial problems? Before continuing with this shocking account, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know what country this story is reaching. This story isn't just about Afghanistan. It's about a problem that still exists in various parts of the world, where more than 14 million girls are forced into marriage every year. Seeta represents thousands of invisible girls who experience the same cruel reality, and her story needs to be known so we can understand the gravity of a system that even today strips childhood from children to solve adults' problems. To fully understand what happened to Seeta, we need to return to the context of where she lived. The mountainous village where she grew up was a place where more than 50% of girls were married before age 18, even though Afghan law established a minimum age of 16 for marriage. But there was something much more sinister operating in this community. Seeta lived in conditions of extreme poverty, in a society deeply marked by tribal traditions that had become corrupted over the centuries. There, girls were frequently treated as merchandise to settle debts or consolidate family alliances. After her mother's death, she became even more vulnerable in this predatory system. Organizations like Human Rights Watch were already documenting in 2010 that there was a frightening pattern in these villages. Families with young daughters always received loans more easily from local merchants. Why this preference? The answer is connected to a discovery that international investigators made years later, a system deliberately designed to capture vulnerable families. But there was something Seeta's father was hiding from her and the entire family, something that would transform his innocent daughter into currency to solve problems she couldn't even understand. And this secret would only be revealed when activists began to deeply investigate these apparently traditional transactions. Ahmed, Seeta's father, wasn't just a man in debt. He had become involved with a specific network of merchants who operated with very particular collection methods. These weren't common debts incurred from basic necessity, but loans that had been strategically offered, almost as if the creditors were waiting for exactly this opportunity. He had lost practically everything trying to keep the family alive after his wife's death, incurring heavy debts with neighbors and local merchants who had violent reputations in the region. These men who collected from him were known for destroying entire families when they didn't receive what they considered due, and their threats became more explicit and dangerous each day. When Ahmed finally couldn't pay anymore, a proposal came from the creditors themselves, a solution they presented as if it were a special favor: deliver his youngest daughter in marriage to cancel the entire debt. It was the type of deal that admitted no refusals, but it also wasn't presented as coercion. It was sold as tradition and family honor. What Ahmed didn't know is that this wasn't a spontaneous solution offered out of compassion. Years later, when investigators mapped these transactions, they would discover there was a method behind this apparent generosity, a system that transformed families' vulnerability into business opportunities. But exactly how did this system work? And why specifically were girls always the preferred solution? The one chosen to resolve Ahmed's debt was Omar, a merchant approximately 50 years old, more than 4 times Seeta's age. Respected by some in the community, feared by others, he already had other wives, all married when they were still teenagers. His reputation was that of a prosperous and traditional man, but there were aspects of his life that the community preferred not to question. When Omar appeared at Ahmed's house to formalize the agreement, he brought elaborate gifts, colorful fabrics, exotic fruits for the region, and even some simple jewelry. He behaved like a respectful suitor, following all the traditional rituals expected for a marriage proposal. To outside observers, it might seem like a normal family arrangement. But in the eyes with which Omar observed Seeta, there was something that made the girl want to disappear, even without fully understanding what was happening. She instinctively felt that something was very wrong, but had no words to express or authority to question a decision that adults had already made for her. What no one in the village publicly questioned is why a 50-year-old man, already married multiple times, continued looking for underage wives. And why did the community not only allow but facilitate these unions? The answer to these questions would only be discovered when activists began investigating the true role that men like Omar played in this system of child exploitation, disguised as tradition. In the village where Seeta lived, the community's reaction to the announcement of her marriage revealed something disturbing about how this system had normalized over generations. No one protested the decision. The neighbors, many of whom had gone through the same experience decades before, congratulated Ahmed as if he had secured an exceptional opportunity for his daughter. They came to Seeta with forced smiles, saying she would have a life of abundance and protection, that Omar was a respected man who could offer stability that the family couldn't provide. Some even expressed envy, suggesting that Seeta was lucky to have attracted the attention of such a prosperous man. But behind these smiles and congratulations, Seeta could perceive something different. There was a look of resignation and sadness in the older women's eyes, as if they were reliving their own stories through her. It was as if the entire community was participating in a theatrical play where everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared break the script. However, 3 days before the scheduled wedding, something extraordinary happened that would completely change the perception of this case. A group of women from the village, led by a brave lady named Amina, decided to break a silence that had lasted decades. What they revealed to activists who arrived in the region wasn't just about Seeta's case, it was about a secret kept for entire generations, a pattern that connected dozens of similar cases in the region. But what exactly did these women know, and why did they decide to speak at that precise moment? On the eve of the wedding, while the house prepared for the next day's ceremony, Seeta's grandmother did something no one expected. She, who had remained silent during the entire negotiation process, finally approached her granddaughter for a conversation that would change everything. Crying in secret so as not to attract the attention of the family's men, the grandmother placed in Seeta's small hands a cloth pouch containing some old coins and a simple ring that had belonged to the girl's mother. But along with these objects, she whispered words that would remain engraved in Seeta's memory forever. One day this might save your life. Keep it safe and always remember who you really are. In that instant, looking into her grandmother's teary eyes, Seeta realized with devastating clarity that she was truly alone, that the adults she trusted to protect her had made a decision that would put her in danger, and that she would have to find ways to protect herself alone. But why did the grandmother choose exactly those objects? And why did her words sound more like survival instructions than simple farewell advice? The answer is related to something the grandmother knew about marriages like this, knowledge acquired through decades of observing the fate of other girls in the community, knowledge she couldn't express openly, but that she tried to transmit through that whispered conversation in the darkness. On March 18, 2010, a date that would be forever marked in Seeta's memory, the entire village gathered in celebration for what they considered a joyful and traditional event. The mountains echoed with the sound of traditional drums, while women prepared special dishes and men discussed future business. Seeta was dressed in a heavy, colorful outfit that transformed her into a human doll. The dress, borrowed from other similar ceremonies, was too big for her small child's body, and the weight of the fabrics and ornaments made her move awkwardly, as if she were wearing a costume that didn't belong to her. Throughout the entire ceremony, she felt as if she were watching everything from outside her own body. She saw people celebrating, heard the religious blessings being pronounced, felt the hands that guided her from one place to another, but none of it seemed real. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. When the local imam asked if she accepted Omar as her husband, her voice could barely leave her throat. The sound she produced was more of a frightened whisper than a conscious response. But in that context, silence wasn't interpreted as hesitation or fear. It was automatically considered shy consent, exactly as expected from a virtuous bride. However, 2 weeks after this ceremony, something completely unexpected happened that would transform Seeta's case into an international issue. She managed to do something that surprised not only her family, but also the activists who were beginning to investigate similar situations in the region. How did an 11-year-old girl, in a situation of complete isolation and control, manage to alert the outside world about what was really happening? And what had she discovered in the first days of marriage that motivated her to act with such courage? The details of what happened to Seeta in the first days after the wedding cannot be fully narrated, out of respect for the dignity of a child who suffered traumas that no human being should experience. But it's necessary to say that physical pain and psychological terror took the place of any remaining memory of her childhood. In that room, in a strange house, far from everything she knew, Seeta was forced to stop being a child in a brutal and definitive way. The reality of what it meant to be the wife of an adult man became clear in a traumatic way, without preparation, without explanation, without true consent. But there, amid the suffering and feeling of complete abandonment, a silent promise was also born that she made to herself. One day she would find a way out. She didn't know how, had no resources or knowledge about the outside world, but something inside her refused to accept that this would be her life forever. What Seeta didn't know in those first days is that her situation was being observed by people outside the village. At that exact moment, international organizations were beginning to map cases of child marriage in the region, and her name would eventually appear in reports that would be used in global campaigns for children's rights. 3 years later, evidence collected from cases like Seeta's would lead to international pressure that would force the Afghan government to at least review some of its child protection laws. But all this would only be possible because Seeta, even being just a child in a situation of extreme vulnerability, found a way to make her voice heard beyond the limits of her isolated village. As the days passed in Omar's house, Seeta gradually got to know the other women who lived there, the other wives who had been acquired in similar ways over the years. Each of them had their own story of pain, but all shared the common experience of having been delivered as teenagers to solve other people's problems. In whispered conversations when Omar wasn't present, these women began to reveal information to Seeta that completely changed her understanding of the situation. They told her about organizations that existed outside the village, groups of activists and international lawyers who worked to help girls in situations like hers. It was through these secret conversations that Seeta heard for the first time the word hope applied to her situation. The other women, even having resigned themselves to their own circumstances, saw in Seeta an opportunity they themselves hadn't had. She was young enough that there was still international interest in her case. They explained that cases involving very young girls sometimes attracted attention from human rights organizations, especially if they could reach the right people outside the local community. But how could a child establish contact with this outside world? And what did the other wives know about international organizations that Seeta needed to learn? 2 weeks after this revelation, something extraordinary happened. Seeta managed to establish contact with her family through a method no one expected, not even the other wives who had given her the initial information. It wasn't an interceptable letter, it wasn't a message through local intermediaries. It was something much more intelligent and courageous than anyone could imagine from an 11-year-old girl. How did she do it? And what kind of information did she manage to transmit that completely changed the course of her case? Months after arriving at Omar's house, a small radio hidden by the other wives brought news that planted a seed of real courage in Seeta's heart. It was the story of a girl only 6 years old, named Nagma, who had managed to escape a forced marriage through the intervention of an American lawyer named Kimberly Motley. Seeta listened carefully to every detail of the story transmitted by the radio, and that success narrative showed her that she wasn't condemned forever to that situation. There were people in the world who cared about girls like her, and there were legal ways to reverse these forced marriages. Now I can reveal the 3 secrets that transformed Seeta's case into an international symbol and allowed her story to be documented by UNICEF and Amnesty International. First, the debt system that captured her family wasn't accidental. Investigators discovered that merchants like those who lent money to Ahmed deliberately operated by offering easy credit to families with young daughters, knowing they could eventually collect through these marriages. It was a predatory system disguised as cultural tradition. Second, men like Omar weren't simply traditional husbands. Many of them functioned as intermediaries in a larger network, collecting girls from rural villages to eventually transfer them to other regions or even other countries. The ex-wives that Seeta never saw hadn't simply left. They had been sent to unknown destinations when they became inconvenient or when better opportunities arose. Third, Seeta managed to communicate her situation to the outside world using a method her grandmother had taught her without her realizing it at the time. The ring and coin she received weren't just mementos, they were recognizable signs by an underground network of women who worked secretly to document cases of abuse. When she managed to send these objects back to her village through a merchant who visited Omar's house, they were recognized by local activists who were investigating the region. Seeta's case mobilized international organizations like UNICEF and Amnesty International, who used her story as a symbol in global campaigns against child marriage. The resulting international pressure forced the Afghan government to at least review some of its child protection laws, although practical implementation continues to be an enormous challenge. Seeta was eventually rescued through the intervention of human rights organizations and today represents the fight against child marriages in international campaigns. Her courage in finding a way to communicate her situation to the outside world not only saved her own life, but also brought international attention to a problem that affects millions of girls worldwide. But Seeta's story teaches us something fundamental. Cases like this don't belong only to the past or to distant cultures. Today, at this very moment, thousands of girls continue being delivered as living currency in exchange for debts or in the name of family honor. According to UNICEF data, 14 million girls are forced into marriage every year, many of them in circumstances similar to Seeta's. That's why your attention and awareness cannot stop here. Share this story in groups, social networks, and with people who need to hear it. Awareness can be the difference between complicit silence and real change. Every person who knows these realities becomes part of a global protection network for vulnerable children. And since you followed Seeta's story to the end, I need to tell you about another case that happened in the same region, just a few months later, but this time involving something the family itself called an honor crime, an expression that, when misinterpreted, justifies acts even more brutal and shocking than what we just saw. Cultural violence can take forms that go beyond our understanding, and the next case will show you how far some people are capable of going when they believe they're defending the family's honor.